The fog that clung to the airfield at RAF Kimbolton on the morning of July 30, 1943, tasted of high-octane aviation fuel and damp English earth. It was 06:15, a time when the world should have been silent, but the air was vibrating with the mechanical coughing of Wright Cyclone radial engines coming to life. Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth stood on the hardstand, watching the propellers of Tondelayo slash through the mist. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not just a machine of aluminum and rivets. To the 10 men who climbed inside her, she was a living ecosystem, a life raft that would carry them into the most hostile environment on Earth. Arooth was 24 years old, a veteran of 12 combat missions over occupied Europe, and credited with 3 confirmed kills. He adjusted his parachute harness, feeling the familiar weight of the gear that had become a second skin. He walked to the rear of the massive bomber, ducking under the horizontal stabilizer that loomed overhead like a cathedral ceiling. He was heading for the tail, the tapered end of the fuselage where the lines of the aircraft converged into a cramped, isolated compartment that served as the eyes and sting of the fortress. To reach his battle station, Arooth had to crawl on his hands and knees through the narrowing fuselage, dragging his flight bag and ammunition belts past the tailwheel assembly. The tail gunner's position was a study in claustrophobia, a metal box measuring barely 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. It was suspended over nothingness, a tiny blister of aluminum and plexiglass at the very end of the plane. Arooth settled onto the small bicycle seat that served as his workspace. Before him, the twin barrels of his Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns pointed backward into the gray dawn. These 65-pound weapons were his only companions. The 8th Air Force crews often called the tail gunner the loneliest job in the war, and the description was not poetic hyperbole, it was a statement of physical fact. Arooth was separated from the waist gunners and the radio operator by 40 feet of hollow fuselage. There was no one to tap him on the shoulder to make sure he was awake. There was no one to help him clear a jammed feed chute. There was no one to apply a tourniquet if a piece of German steel found its mark. He was an island. As the bomber vibrated with the pre-flight run-up, Arooth checked his equipment with the obsessive detail of a man who knew the cost of failure. At 25,000 feet, the operational altitude for the mission to Kassel, the outside air temperature would plummet to 60 degrees below zero. At that altitude, exposed skin froze instantly. Metal burned to the touch. The only thing standing between Arooth and death by hypothermia was his electrically heated flight suit, a blue wool bunny suit wired with copper filaments that plugged into the bomber's electrical system. If the rheostat failed, or if enemy fire severed the cord, he would lose the use of his hands in minutes and his life shortly after. He plugged in his intercom, the umbilical cord that connected him to the pilot and the rest of the crew, and listened to the static-laced chatter. The voices were calm, professional, masking the churning anxiety that every man felt before the wheels left the ground. They were going deep today. Kassel was an industrial hub, a center of locomotive and tank production, and the Luftwaffe knew exactly how valuable it was. Intelligence reports estimated that over 300 German fighter aircraft were positioned along the flight path, waiting to intercept the bomber stream. The statistics of the summer of 1943 were a grim arithmetic that every airman knew but rarely spoke aloud. The average life expectancy of a B-17 crew was 11 missions. A tour of duty was 25 missions. The math did not favor the brave. Within that terrifying average, the survival rates for tail gunners were the lowest on the aircraft, rivaled only by the ball turret gunner curled into the belly of the plane. The reason for this high mortality rate was simple physics. German fighter pilots, flying battle-hardened Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, preferred attacking from the rear. The tail position was the first thing they saw, the first thing they targeted, and the first thing they hit. The tail gunner sat at the tip of the spear, absorbing the initial wave of 20mm cannon shells and high-velocity machine gun fire. By July, The 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 empty bunks in the barracks, 90 letters written to mothers in Ohio and wives in Pennsylvania. The fundamental problem was not courage, but geometry. The experienced pilots of the Luftwaffe understood the mechanics of aerial combat better than the planners in Washington realized. Approaching a bomber from behind gave the fighter pilot the longest possible firing window. A Messerschmitt closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position had nearly 10 seconds to stabilize his aircraft, aim his cannons, and fire before he had to break away to avoid a collision. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to defend himself, but the odds were stacked against him. The Focke-Wulf 190, known as the Butcher Bird, carried a devastating armament of 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single, well-placed burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, turning the compartment into a slaughterhouse of flying glass and metal. Even if the gunner survived, the control cables for the rudder and elevators ran directly through the tail section. If those cables were severed, the bomber became uncontrollable, a falling leaf of aluminum spiraling into the European countryside. The situation was compounded by the standard gunnery doctrine taught by the Army Air Forces. In training schools across the United States, instructors drilled a strict set of rules into young gunners. They preached patience. They preached the conservation of ammunition. They taught students to hold their fire until the enemy was within 300 yards. The theory was based on the idea that ammunition was limited and long-range fire was inaccurate. In a classroom, it made sense. In the violent reality of the skies over Germany, it was a suicide pact. 300 yards meant the enemy was already well within his own effective firing range. By the time a tail gunner following the manual squeezed his triggers, the German pilot had already been firing for 2 or 3 seconds. Arooth had watched this doctrine kill his friends. On his 6th mission, he had looked out his side window to see a B-17 flying off Tondelayo's right wing take a direct hit to the tail. The gunner in that plane had followed the rules. He had waited. The German fighter had come in fast, guns blazing from 600 yards out, and the American gunner had died without ever firing a shot. Michael Arooth began to question everything he had been told. He realized that the Luftwaffe pilots were exploiting the American training manual like a tactical roadmap. They attacked from maximum range specifically because they knew the gunners would not shoot back. They treated the B-17s not as dangerous adversaries, but as passive targets. Arooth decided that if he wanted to survive to see his 25th mission, he would have to rewrite the rules. He began to study the approach speeds and trajectories of the German fighters. He realized that a fighter approaching from directly astern presented a stable, non-deflected target. Unlike a fighter attacking from the side, which required leading the target by yards, a fighter coming from the 6 o'clock position was essentially stationary in the gun sight, just getting larger. Arooth concluded that he could engage these targets effectively at 600, 700, or even 800 yards. The doctrine said it was impossible. Arooth believed it was necessary. 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning, clawing for altitude through the heavy cloud layers. Tondelayo joined the formation, slotting into its position in the 379th Bombardment Group's combat box. The formation was designed to provide overlapping fields of fire, a flying porcupine of machine guns that no fighter could penetrate. That was the theory. In practice, the formation was only as strong as its weakest gunner. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts climbed to meet them, their massive radial engines providing a temporary shield. But the Thunderbolts had a fatal flaw: range. They carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. They could escort the bombers across the Channel and over the coast of Belgium, but they would have to turn back long before the target. For the final 200 miles to Kassel, the bombers would be naked. Arooth checked his ammunition belts again. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. The manual stated this was sufficient for a standard mission, assuming short, disciplined bursts at close range. Arooth knew that his new tactic of long-range engagement would burn through ammunition at a terrifying rate. He had done the math. If he fired at every fighter from 800 yards out, he might run dry before they even reached the target. It was a gamble. He was betting that running out of ammo later was better than dying with full belts now. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a poor bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's aim, forcing the German pilot to break off his run before he could deliver a killing blow. If that meant wasting bullets, so be it. Dead men had no use for reserves. His first test of this theory had occurred during a raid on Saint-Nazaire weeks earlier. A pair of Bf-109s had lined up for a classic tail attack. Standard procedure screamed, "Wait!" Arooth had opened fire at 700 yards, watching his tracers arc across the sky. They fell short at first, but he walked them up, adjusting his aim like a man handling a garden hose. The lead German pilot, seeing red tracers flashing past his canopy long before he expected resistance, panicked. He broke off his attack dive early, peeling away without firing a shot. His wingman followed. Tondelayo remained untouched. The crew chief had chewed Arooth out after the mission for expending 200 rounds on a single engagement without a confirmed kill. Arooth had simply replied that the plane was still flying. The crew chief remained skeptical, and rumors began to circulate that Arooth was reckless, a cowboy who would leave his crew defenseless when it mattered most. But Tondelayo kept coming home. Now, crossing the coast of Belgium, the moment of truth arrived. Arooth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings, a silent salute, before banking sharply 180 degrees back toward England. The fighter cover was gone. The bomber stream was alone in the hostile sky. Arooth scanned the horizon, his eyes straining against the glare of the sun. The silence on the intercom was heavy, filled with the breathing of 10 men waiting for the violence to start. At 11:42, the first specks appeared in the distance, climbing from the southeast. They were small black dots against the clouds, growing larger with every heartbeat. Arooth counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The sky behind Tondelayo began to fill with the angular silhouettes of the Luftwaffe. These were the hunters of Jagdgeschwader 1 and 11, the elite defense of the Reich. They maneuvered with practiced ease, positioning themselves high above the bombers, preparing to dive. The lead fighter, a Messerschmitt with a yellow nose, rolled over and began its attack run from the 6 o'clock high position. It dove toward the bomber formation at 400 miles per hour, its intent clear. Arooth tracked the aircraft through his spiderweb gun sight. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. At 800 yards, a distance his instructors would have called a waste of time, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, the recoil vibrating through the entire tail section. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic hammering that drowned out the drone of the engines. Bright red tracers streamed out from the tail of Tondelayo, reaching out into the void. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into the empty air below the diving fighter. Arooth adjusted his aim, elevating the guns, walking the stream of fire upward. At 600 yards, the geometry clicked. The tracers began connecting. Bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling and wing roots. The German pilot, realizing he was flying into a buzzsaw of lead long before he was ready to fire his own cannons, broke hard to the right. Smoke trailed from his engine as he abandoned the attack run. He never fired a single shot at Tondelayo. Arooth released the triggers, conserving his precious remaining rounds. He didn't have time to watch the fighter fall. The second attacker was already closing. This one came in lower, hugging the bottom of the formation,
trying to slip beneath Arooth's field of fire. The angle was difficult, forcing Arooth to depress his guns to their mechanical limit, straining against the mounting. He fired anyway, a long, aggressive burst that chewed up the air between them.
The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and spraying his cannon shells harmlessly into the sky above the bomber. The battle had begun, and it would not stop for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the formation, looking for stragglers, looking for smoke, looking for weakness. Arooth was a whirlwind of motion, swinging the heavy twin guns from side to side, firing at everything that came within range. His gun barrels began to glow cherry red from the friction of the bullets. The smell of cordite filled the cramped compartment, a sharp, metallic tang that burned the back of his throat. He was burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate, but he was keeping the fighters at bay. He was creating a zone of denial behind Tondelayo, a wall of flying steel that forced the Germans to respect his position. At 12:29, a single Bf-109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level. The pilot was either incredibly brave or fatally arrogant, perhaps assuming the gunner was reloading or dead. Arooth centered the fighter in his sight, took a breath, and held the triggers down. The Brownings hammered for 6 continuous seconds, a lifetime in aerial combat. He poured over 100 rounds into the approaching aircraft. The result was catastrophic. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in midair. The engine block separated from the fuselage, tumbling away. The wings folded backward as the main spar failed. What remained of the fighter whipped past Tondelayo's tail, close enough that Arooth could momentarily see the empty cockpit where the pilot had been. It was his second confirmed kill of the mission. He glanced at his ammunition counter. He was down to 180 rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51. The city lay below, a sprawling target obscured by smoke screens and flak bursts. The bombers entered the bomb run, the most dangerous phase of the mission. For 11 minutes, the aircraft had to fly straight and level, unable to take evasive action, while the bombardiers used their Norden sights to line up the drop. To the Luftwaffe, this was the dinner bell. The fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury, sensing the vulnerability of the Americans. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from the 5 o'clock position, coming in fast and hard. Arooth swung his guns to meet it, firing a short, desperate burst. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root, tearing off pieces of aluminum, but the pilot kept coming, disciplined and determined. Suddenly, the world exploded. Cannon shells from the Focke-Wulf tore through Tondelayo's tail section. Arooth felt the impacts before he felt the pain, a series of sledgehammer blows against the fuselage. Fragments of 20mm explosive shells ripped through the plexiglass window, shattering it into 1,000 razor-sharp shards. The shrapnel shredded his flight suit and buried itself in his left arm and shoulder. His left machine gun jammed violently, the feed mechanism crushed by a direct hit. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment, coating everything in a slick red mist. The cold air rushed in through the broken window, instantly freezing the blood that was pooling on the floor. Arooth was wounded, bleeding, and down to 1 working gun. The German fighter was circling back for the kill. The manual said he was dead. The statistics said he was dead. But Michael Arooth was still breathing, and he had 63 rounds left. The return flight from Kassel was a journey through a frozen hell. Tondelayo turned westward with the remnants of the bomber stream, leaving the burning factories behind them under a shroud of black smoke. Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth remained at his position in the tail, a solitary figure amidst the wreckage of his compartment. The sub-zero wind screamed through the shattered plexiglass, whipping around the cramped space and biting into his exposed skin. His left arm was useless, hanging limp at his side, the sleeve of his flight suit dark and heavy with blood that was beginning to freeze into a solid crust. He fought against the gray veil of shock that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He knew that if he passed out now, he would die. Either the cold would take him, or the Luftwaffe would. The German fighters were not finished. They had refueled and rearmed, and now they were regrouping over Belgium, waiting to catch the wounded bombers as they limped back toward the English Channel. Arooth checked his weapon. The left Browning was dead, its receiver smashed beyond repair. The right gun was functional, but the ammunition situation was critical. He had 63 rounds remaining. In a standard engagement, 63 rounds would last for perhaps 4 seconds of sustained fire. He had to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace with 4 seconds of protection. The mathematics of survival had shifted from geometry to pure ruthlessness. There could be no warning shots. There could be no suppressive fire to keep heads down. Every single bullet had to find metal. Arooth wedged his body against the frame of the seat to stabilize himself against the turbulence. He cleared the blood from his goggles with a trembling hand and scanned the gray sky for the silhouette of the enemy. He was no longer a soldier following orders. He was a predator, guarding his cave with a single stone left to throw. At 13:31, the second gauntlet began. A pair of Messerschmitt Bf-109s appeared from the clouds at the 7 o'clock position. They spotted the damage to Tondelayo's tail, the missing glass, the jagged holes in the aluminum skin, and smelled blood. The lead pilot signaled his wingman and banked around to line up for a finishing run. Arooth watched them come. His instincts screamed at him to fire, to push them back, but he forced himself to wait. He let them cross the 800-yard line. He let them cross the 600-yard line. He was playing a game of chicken with men who had 20-millimeter cannons. At 500 yards, the lead German stabilized his aircraft for the kill. In that split second of stillness, Arooth squeezed the trigger. He fired a microburst, perhaps 12 rounds in total. The tracers flashed out in a tight cluster, striking the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. The impacts were precise and devastating. The German fighter shuddered, rolled violently to the left, and entered a steep dive, trailing a plume of white glycol coolant. The wingman, seeing his leader crippled by a bomber that was supposed to be defenseless, broke off his attack instantly and vanished into the clouds. Arooth checked his ammo counter. 51 rounds remaining. Tondelayo crossed into French airspace at 14:15. The fighter attacks finally began to diminish as the Luftwaffe interceptors reached the limit of their fuel endurance. The bomber stream, ragged and thinned, droned on toward the coast. By 14:47, they had outrun the last of the pursuit. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, a flat gray expanse that looked like salvation. The landing at RAF Kimbolton at 15:52 was a blur of noise and pain. As the bomber taxied to a halt, the ground crew rushed the aircraft. They had to pry Arooth out of the tail compartment. His blood had frozen to the metal seat, fusing him to the airframe. They lowered him gently to the tarmac, where a flight surgeon cut away his flight suit to assess the damage. He counted 11 separate fragmentation wounds in Arooth's arm, shoulder, and upper back. But the gunner was alive. And more importantly, the bomber was alive. News of the mission spread through the 379th Bombardment Group before the engines had even cooled. In the mess halls and the barracks, the story was passed from crew to crew. The tail gunner on Tondelayo had survived the castle raid with 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables, all while wounded, and he had done it by breaking every rule in the book. The intelligence officers were baffled. The standard doctrine insisted that long-range fire was a waste of ammunition. Yet Arooth had opened fire at 800 yards and survived, while gunners who waited until 300 yards were being buried. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer pulled the gun camera footage from Tondelayo. The grainy black-and-white film told an undeniable truth. It showed Arooth's tracers reaching out far beyond the accepted effective range. But instead of missing, the tracers created a psychological barrier. The German pilots, seeing fire coming at them so early, were forced to react defensively. They jinked, they rolled, they broke off their runs. By the time they regained their firing solutions, the window of opportunity had closed. Arooth hadn't just outshot them, he had disrupted their entire attack rhythm. By mid-August, the Arooth technique began to spread like a contagion through the squadron. 3 other tailgunners, desperate to improve their odds, adopted the practice of early engagement. The results were immediate and statistically significant. The bombers, protected by aggressive tailgunners, were returning with less battle damage and fewer casualties. The correlation was impossible to ignore. On September 1st, the group commander received a preliminary report suggesting that the defensive doctrine of the 8th Air Force, the very Bible of aerial combat, was fundamentally flawed. While the brass in London debated the data, Arooth healed. He spent 3 weeks in the station hospital, fighting the stiffness in his shoulder and the dull ache of the shrapnel wounds. He was cleared for flight duty on August 19th. He didn't ask for a discharge. He didn't ask for a transfer. He asked for his plane. The original Tondelayo had been written off, structurally compromised by the cannon fire it had absorbed. A shiny new B-17G sat on the hardstand, painted with the same name. Arooth climbed back into the tail on August 26th, but the enemy was adapting. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers were not blind. They analyzed the gun camera footage from their own fighters and interviewed returning pilots. They noticed the shift in American tactics. The safe approach from the 6 o'clock position was no longer safe. The Americans were reaching out and touching them before they could get into range. In response, the German tactics evolved. They began to favor high-speed slashing attacks from the high 6, diving at nearly 500 miles per hour to minimize their exposure time. They also began to coordinate mass attacks, swarming a single bomber with 3 or 4 fighters simultaneously to overwhelm the gunner. The air war had become a lethal chess match, with each side countering the other's moves in blood. Arooth knew that his trick would not work forever. The element of surprise was fading. The mission scheduled for September 6, 1943, was designated to target Stuttgart. It was a deep penetration raid, sending the bombers 500 miles into southern Germany to strike the ball bearing factories that kept the Wehrmacht rolling. The mission planners knew it would be a meat grinder. Stuttgart was ringed by hundreds of flak guns and defended by the elite fighter wings of the Luftwaffe. The 379th Bombardment Group was assigned the lead position in the combat wing. This was a place of honor, but also a place of maximum danger. The lead group was the first to trigger the flak, the first to be spotted by radar, and the first to be engaged by fighters. Arooth loaded his guns the night before. This time, he didn't stop at 800 rounds. He loaded 1,200 rounds of belted .50 caliber ammunition. The extra weight would burn more fuel, but Arooth didn't care. He knew what was waiting for them over the Black Forest. Black Monday, as it would come to be known, began at 5:40. 187 bombers launched into the overcast sky. The fighter attacks began over France at 9:15 and never let up. By the time they reached the German border, the sky was a chaotic swirl of contrails, exploding flak, and falling debris. At 10:08, a staffel of 12 Bf-109s ambushed the formation from below. Arooth, applying his aggressive doctrine, opened fire at 700 yards. He scattered the lead element, damaging one fighter and forcing 2 others to break away. But the swarm was too thick. Cannon shells ripped through the formation, tearing wings off bombers and sending men tumbling into the void without parachutes. Arooth kept firing, his guns overheating, his hands moving in a blur as he tracked targets across the sky. He was a machine, a component of the turret, dispensing death in half-second bursts. At 10:31, the end came. A Focke-Wulf 190, piloted by an expert who knew exactly how to exploit the sun's glare, dove on Tondelayo from the high 6 position. Arooth never saw him until the wings lit up with muzzle flashes. The German pilot didn't miss. A volley of 20mm explosive shells slammed into the tail section. The impact was catastrophic. The plexiglass disintegrated. The receiver of Arooth's left machine gun was sheared in half. Shrapnel tore through the aluminum skin and slammed into Arooth's body, reopening his old wounds and carving new ones across his scalp and chest. The force of the explosion threw him violently against the gun sight, blinding him with his own blood. He didn't lose consciousness, but he lost his sight for a terrifying moment. He wiped the red smear from his eyes and grabbed the handles of his remaining gun. He fired blindly into the slipstream, a defiant roar against the dying light. The Focke-Wulf pulled up, trailing smoke, but the damage was done. Tondelayo was mortally wounded. The control cables to the tail were severed. The hydraulic lines were cut, bleeding red fluid into the slipstream. Fuel was streaming from the wing roots. The pilots fought the heavy controls, managing to keep the bomber level long enough to drop their payload over Stuttgart, but they could not hold the formation. Tondelayo fell back, a straggler in a sky full of wolves. The crew jettisoned everything they could to lighten the load: guns, ammo, flak jackets, radios. They limped across France at treetop level, hoping to avoid radar. They didn't make it to England. The fuel gauges hit 0 over the English Channel. At 15:12, the pilots ditched the massive bomber into the gray, churning water. Tondelayo hit the waves at 120 miles per hour and broke her back. The fuselage snapped in two. Arooth was thrown forward into the gun mount, the metal biting into his skull. When he woke up, he was bobbing in a yellow rubber life raft, the salt spray stinging his open wounds. British air-sea rescue launches were already speeding toward them. Miraculously, all 10 men of the crew had survived the crash. Tondelayo was gone, sinking to the bottom of the channel, taking Arooth's blood-stained seat with her. But the men were alive. Arooth was carried ashore on a stretcher, his war finally over. The aftermath of Arooth's crusade changed the Army Air Forces forever. On October 14, 1943, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest award for valor. The citation explicitly recognized his aggressive defensive fires and his refusal to leave his post while wounded. But the real victory wasn't the medal, it was the manual. By November, the 8th Air Force gunnery doctrine had been officially revised. The "wait until 300 yards" rule was scrapped. The data from Arooth's missions, combined with reports from other groups, proved that long-range disruption was the key to bomber survival. General Frederick Anderson signed the order that validated the Arooth technique. Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth, a 24-year-old kid from Massachusetts, had rewritten the book on aerial combat. Arooth never flew in combat again. The head injuries from the ditching caused recurring vision problems and severe headaches that grounded him permanently. He was sent home to the United States in early 1944, but not to rest. The Army put him to work teaching. He spent the rest of the war at gunnery schools, standing before classrooms of frightened young men, teaching them how to survive. He taught them to ignore the old manuals. He taught them to shoot first. He taught them that geometry was a weapon. The thousands of gunners who passed through his classes took those lessons to the skies over Berlin and Tokyo, and countless numbers of them came home, because Michael Arooth had figured out the puzzle first. In 1947, when the Air Force became an independent branch of the military, Michael Arooth did something that baffled his family. He re-enlisted. The man who had faced death a dozen times, who had been shot, frozen, and crashed into the sea, chose to stay in uniform. He served for another 15 years, retiring in 1962 as a master sergeant. He had found a home in the service, a sense of purpose that civilian life could not replicate. He died on February 15, 1990, in St. Augustine, Florida. He was buried in the National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona. His tombstone is simple, listing only his rank and his wars. It does not mention the 17 fighter aircraft he destroyed. It does not mention the B-17s he saved. It does not mention that he changed the way the war was fought. But in the archives of the mighty 8th Air Force Museum, the mission reports still exist. They tell the story of the lonely tail gunner who refused to be a victim, the man who looked at the impossible math of survival and decided to change the equation.